This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted that you could join us today. My name is Dr. Susan Murphy, and I'm Associate Professor in International Development in Trinity College in Dublin. And I'm also the Chair of the Development Studies Association. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to today's event. It's part of the 2026 Development Matters lecture series, kindly supported by Irish Aid, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So we're really delighted to be joined today by our guest speaker. I should call you as an academic to academic professor, but I won't. I'm going to give you your formal title for today. So João Gomes Cravinho, who's EU Special Representative for the Sahel. And Special Representative Cravinho will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we will move into a Q&A session with our audience. For those of you in the room, please raise your hand if you have any questions, and please do introduce yourself and the institution with which you are based. And if you're tuning in online, please do use the QA function, and we have the facility here beside us to ensure that we can bring your voice into the room. As a reminder, today's session and the QA session will both be recorded, and so please do bear that in mind. So before I formally introduce Mr. or Special Representative Cravinho, I'll hand over to the representative from Irish Aid, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Director General Michael Gaffey, whom we're really pleased to welcome today to the Institute with some introductory remarks. So Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Susan, Professor. It is a real honor to be here. Well, it's always an honor to be in the IIEA, and it's always good to be part of the Development Matters series, which we've been running for quite a few years now with the IIEA, in order to kind of open up debate on international development and international development issues. And I would argue that that is probably more needed now than at any time in recent history. But it is a particular honor to have here the EU Special Representative for the Sahel, João Cravinho, who has made, and you will see it when he's introduced, who has made a huge impact in a short time on, how will I put it, bringing sense, shall we say, to the European Union's approach to the Sahel. If it wasn't for the attack in Mali last week or the week before, I think our media probably wouldn't even know that there were issues in the Sahel. Many people wouldn't even know where or what the Sahel is. And yet there is a crisis in the Sahel, both political, military, and massively humanitarian, that is of direct importance for the European Union. I think it's important for us to look on the Sahel as actually in the neighborhood of the European Union. And the impact of what happens there will have a strong impact on Europe. And I think João will be able to set out for you how Europe can respond more effectively to the situation there. For us in Ireland, I think the public and even our NGO community have a tendency to look elsewhere in Africa, and yet there's a huge amount of work going on in the Sahel, both by Irish NGOs, but also by Irish Aid in collaboration and partnership with the UN system. And last year alone, we provided over 17 million in assistance, development and humanitarian assistance for the Sahel. And it's not as well known as it should be. The Sahel has been described as the epicenter of global terrorism, with over half of deaths from terrorism last year happening in the Sahel alone. And the situation that we have seen developing in recent times really gives real cause for concern about how the situation is developing. So rather than talking about this myself, I just want to say that it is a really great moment in the Development Matters series that we have João here to explain and to teach us, I suppose, a lot about what is actually happening in the Sahel, how Europe can respond, and in a way what Ireland can do in our forthcoming presidency to help strengthen that response. Thank you very much, and you're all very welcome.
So I'd like to introduce our speaker today. I started by saying professor because Special Representative has a PhD from the University of Oxford, a master's from the LSE, and currently teaches a module. I have to say I'd love to get my hands on that module. Currently teaches a module in EU as a defence actor in Sciences Po in Paris. So, incredibly informed participant today. So you are Special Representative for the Sahel, the EU Special Representative for the Sahel, appointed in December 2024. A Special Representative has served in the government of Portugal as Minister for Foreign Affairs from March 2022 to April 2024, and the Minister for National Defence from October 2018 to March 2022. Prior to that, he was Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and Cooperation from March 2005 to 2011, and he served as Ambassador of the European Union for India from December 2011 to July 2017, and to Brazil from August 2015 to October 2018. We're very much looking forward to hearing your contribution today. And so with that, I would like to welcome you to our podium, Special Representative. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Susan. And thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jill, for the invitation to be here. It's really thrilling for me to have this opportunity and to talk about the Sahel. I think that, as Michael has pointed out, in Europe, there is something of a deficit of attention towards the Sahel. And when I say deficit, it's because it's a lot less than it should be. We've got, I think, a couple of timely reasons to be talking about the Sahel. The events, recent events in Mali, of course, have focused our attention. But also we've got the Irish presidency coming up, Irish presidency of the European Union. I think that's a very relevant moment to be thinking about what role the Sahel can play in that presidency. And this is a Europe Week. We're a few days away from May the 9th, so good to be thinking about Europe and how Europe can be relevant. Let me start by saying something which I think is fairly obvious, which is that Europe and the Sahel do have enormously long-standing, deep historical ties. And I think that there's an enormous amount of awareness of this in the Sahel, and probably a lot less awareness of this in Europe. And here in Europe, we have, I would say, been rather slow to identify all of the ongoing transformations that have been taking place in Europe itself and in the Sahel over the past quarter century. So if we take the beginning of this century as a starting point and look at the transformations in Europe and in Africa, they're actually quite momentous. In Africa, just generalizing very quickly, I think we find many populations very frustrated with the regimes that have not delivered for them, that have not created circumstances for this very vital youth. We're talking about a part of the world, Africa as a whole, where 65% of the population is 25 and under. In the Sahel, 70% is 25 and under. And that gives an entirely different flavor to local dynamics. In Europe, when we talk about policies for the youth, we're thinking of maybe higher education, first opportunities for first employment. We're thinking about policies for 15, 20% of our population. In the Sahel, that is the population. It's a completely different framework that we have to deal with. And it's a frustrated population. It's a population that feels it has nowhere to go, that it has no prospects, economic opportunities are very scarce, and of course there is considerable insecurity. And they blame this on previous regimes, regimes that were supported by the West, or they are seen that way. They look at Europe as having also failed them because Europe supported regimes which were, in fact, incapable of delivering for different reasons. And the result of this is that also democracy itself does not have a great name in circumstances where the only memory of democratic regimes, or regimes that occasionally held elections, is that they failed to deliver. And so when Europeans then say what you need is more democracy, this somehow does not strike a relevant chord at all. So this is what we're looking at when we see this young African population. And in the European side, when we think about the last quarter century, what we can see is, of course, the tremendous challenges that we have around us now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with the conflagrations in the Middle East, with the more recent situation in Iran, and above all, we have seen, of course, since the expansion of the European Union, we have seen the focus of attention, of our geopolitical attention, go eastward and not towards Africa. So there has been, I would say, a certain level of distraction on the European side, not on the African side. The Africans have not been distracted in relation to Europe, but they have become increasingly frustrated. So the result of this is that largely our conversations have been, I would say, not dialogues, but simultaneous monologues, whereby there has been a great incapacity to stop and listen and work out where the other one is coming from, and on that basis to try to develop a new approach. On the contrary, our 20th century donor-recipient type of conversation has gone on until far too long. In some cases, it still persists. And certainly, this kind of conversation is now completely anachronistic and counterproductive. And so I will come back to this, as I have been coming back to it a lot over the last year and a half. It all starts with being capable of listening and willing to set aside some prejudices and to try to work out what the other one is actually trying to communicate. During this process, while we were distracted, as Michael's pointed out, the Sahel has become the epicenter of global terrorism. The Sahel it's just over the horizon. It's the neighborhood of our neighborhood, or it's actually far too close for us to be not paying attention. And yet we see this in the Sahel, a conflagration of a confluence of a number of factors that make it into perhaps, say, the most structural polycrisis anywhere in the world. It's deeply resource dependent. Climate-induced displacement of the populations is happening at a very significant rate in vast areas with very limited control of the state. When we talk about the Sahel, we're talking, depends on definitions, but probably around 3 million square kilometers, which is the European Union is 4 million square kilometers, so 3/4 of the size of the European Union. Very limited presence of the states anywhere in that vast expanse. Very rapid, unregulated urban growth. So the cities, particularly the capital cities, are absorbing population which is fleeing from situations of great insecurity, but without the infrastructure, without the capacity to absorb, and this tremendous lack of opportunity, lack of economic opportunity, especially for the young people, which, as I've said, are most of the population. So all of this that I've just said is not very new, and it's not very unpredictable, and so much so that back in 2011, there was a document that Ireland signed and about 39 other countries signed, called the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile and Conflict-Affected States. 2011, it was a roadmap, This roadmap, I quote, says that transitioning out of fragility is long political work requiring country leadership and ownership. International partners can often bypass national interests and international partners can now often bypass national interests and actors, providing aid in overly technocratic ways that underestimate the importance of harmonizing with the national and local context. The global community can recurrently support short-term results at the expense of medium to long-term results brought about by building capacity and building systems. End of quote. And this document didn't just limit itself to the diagnosis, to trying to explain what it was seeing. It also provided a framework for action, namely, and I quote again, to support inclusive, country-led, country-owned responses, facilitating broad in-country consultations, mobilizing and managing resources so they can be adapted to the specific realities and needs of fragile countries. So, end quote. My point here is that, unfortunately, these ideas are still perfectly relevant a decade and a half later. So we have all the theoretical tools. What we haven't done is put them into practice. And I would say that if there is one region where Europe's approach to Africa is being fundamentally tested, it's the Sahel. Sahel has become a kind of stress test for European external action and for the effectiveness of our instruments. And so far we are, I would say, somewhat lacking in our response. What we see in the Sahel are armed groups, together with armed groups of various sorts, including organized crime, exploiting the lack of socioeconomic chances, exploiting governance vacuums. We see geopolitical competition, which is at an all-time high in the region, with geopolitical rivals making offers that can look appealing at first sight, but which are often short-term oriented and focused just on an anti-Western rhetoric, which has traction. We see that the European Union's quite comprehensive foreign policy toolkit, development cooperation, humanitarian aid, also security and defense support, all of this has been and I would say is still being very much underutilized. So what we've done in the last month, last year and a half, but approved in November of last year, is to develop what we call the renewed approach to the Sahel. And this emerges as an effort to provide a response to this complex environment. The renewed approach, the term that was given to the document that was discussed and validated at the Foreign Affairs Council last November, it's an approach. So it's not a strategy. It's not a recipe book. It's more of a compass indicating directions we need to be leading in. The goal for this compass, the end state, if you can ever speak of end state in permanently evolving international relations, but in any case, where we want to reach is a point where Europe becomes once again the natural partner of choice for the countries of West Africa. This doesn't mean the only partner. There is no reason for us to assume or to desire a monopoly. We have to respect that countries anywhere in the world are sovereign and will want to establish relations with other parts of the world. So it's not a question of monopoly. It's a question of being the one that countries turn to first and most easily in terms of their international needs. So this end state is, I would say, one that wouldn't have been questioned 25 years ago, and yet today it is something that we have to re-achieve, because that is not what we are today. The renewed approach starts from the position that disengagement is not an option. It's not an option for various reasons, namely because we cannot afford to have a state of, say, complete absence of state control over vast expanses of territory so close to us. So disengagement is not an option. And there are various reasons for this. The first one of which is that we have key interests in the region. We have key interests that we have to promote and protect. And I don't think that we should be concerned about whether it's appropriate for our foreign policy to be promoting our interests. That's what foreign policies do. And sometimes they disguise them. Sometimes they have extra components as well. But interests lie at the core of our foreign policy concerns. And what interests do we have? Well, in large parts of Europe, questions of mobility and migration are very high on the political radar. So that's one. We're talking about 100 million people who live in the Sahel. Combating terrorism, I think, is consensually considered an interest that we have to be looking out for, and we have this global epicenter of terrorism just over the horizon. We have root causes of terrorism, which, if you're going to talk about terrorism, then you have to go a little step further. At least most of us believe that. Some think that you can just fire a missile and deal with it. But for those of us who don't, then we need to be thinking about how terrorism has arisen, why it is, where it finds its possibilities for recruitment and growth. And once you do that, you start seeing all of the other socioeconomic factors that are related. So root causes of terrorism, I would say, constitute an interest, or dealing with root causes of terrorism. And associated to that, at least minimal levels of infrastructural development, access to basic services. Young people who are being recruited into Al-Qaeda or Islamic State linked groups, they are not doing it out of religious fanaticism. They are doing it because they see no alternative possibilities of living a useful life. And so the notion that what we are facing is actually some kind of fundamental clash of civilizations, I think really misses the point. So we have these direct interests, and as I say, this is foundational, a core element of our renewed approach. In order to start to work on that, we need to be able to explain what our interests are. And again, we have not been very good at that. We have not been reaching out. It's not only that we have not been listening, we have not been explaining to ourselves. Arriving in the Sahel and saying, we're here because we want to help you. What goes through the interlocutor's mind is, what is the hidden agenda this person has that he doesn't want to tell us about? So it's much more honest, much more transparent, and much more productive to say, we're really worried. We've got a problem because we're really worried about whatever it may be, about the expansion of terrorism, about the unregulated migratory flows. Let's see what we can do together. That, I think, is a much healthier basis for a conversation, one that is much more likely to produce results. This is not being transactional. I really don't like that term. Transaction is when you go to the kiosk and buy a newspaper. You want the newspaper, you give some money, the seller is happy, he's sold his newspaper. It doesn't say anything about what happens next. And in relationships, you have to build them. It's not about being transactional. It is about working out how interests can converge, our interests and their interests. So for that, you need to have a much better level of conversation. Another element to this, of course, is the fact that the Sahel has become this rather crowded geopolitical arena, close to us, and one that I think that we should be worried about. We see Russia very strongly present now. We see China, but China's present all over the African continent, and the Chinese focus is different from the Russian one. Chinese very much concentrated on resource extraction. We see Turkey, which at the beginning of this century had 7 embassies on the African continent and now has 44, and many other levers of soft power also that it is working on, and it's become a very significant economic actor, and particularly an arms provider. We see Gulf countries making investments, but above all exporting to Africa some of their Gulf rivalries. And Russia, returning to Russia, what I would like to point out is that geostrategically, from a Kremlin perspective, what is really interesting about the Sahel is precisely what I've been saying, that it's too close to Europe for us to be comfortable. It is the soft underbelly of the European Union, from a Kremlin perspective, perhaps even more relevantly, the soft underbelly of NATO. We hope that sooner rather than later, there will be some kind of settlement in Ukraine. And again, hopefully a just settlement in Ukraine. But when that happens, Russia will not cease to be Russia. Russia will not cease to be interested in having levers of destabilization that it can use against Europe. And the Sahel is really, I think, the best candidate for significant Russian investment, which will become available in terms of material resources, military resources, equipment, men, not only available, but actually they will need to find some conduit for this excess of manpower that will come when they finish, when the war, when there's some kind of settlement in Ukraine. All of these criminals that Russia has taken out of its prisons in order to send to the front line, they were criminals before. Now they are battle-hardened criminals, or criminals with PTSD. Russia is not going to want to have them back in the villages and the towns. Sahel is an excellent option for. So we're going to see, in all likelihood, a significant increase of Russian presence in the Sahel, and there are fairly clear geostrategic reasons why it should do that. So this is, again, another reason for us to be working towards taking away the circumstances that allow that to happen. Then, I mean, I'm not going to talk extensively about the geography of the Sahel, but it's linked right up to what's going on in the Sudan. The war in the Sudan has consequences on the Sahel. It's linked to piracy in the Gulf of Guinea on the west side of the African continent. So it is really of significant strategic importance for us. What we've tried to do over the last year and a half then is to develop this renewed approach that would allow us, European Union, to regain relevance in the regions. And in order to do that, we've been working on 3 fronts. The first front is convergence amongst European member states. Our foreign policy, European Union foreign policy being what it is, if we don't have convergence, we have nothing. We have no capacity to project. So convergence amongst member states has been a central issue that I've been working on. Secondly, to provide coherence and consistency amongst in this toolbox, in these multiple instruments that we have in the European Union, which are considerable, quite powerful. And yet, if you don't have a clear foreign policy guidance, what happens with instruments? They don't stay still. Institutions, particularly big institutions, when they don't have a political orientation, they do their own thing. They work according to their own internal dynamics, which can have all sorts of configurations. And so I think that if we look back at the last few years at what has been European contribution, put it that way, to the Sahel, we find all sorts of things and the opposite. We find many contradictory approaches which are really a waste of our resources because they are not contributing to any coherent European approach. So that's the second element, is getting the institutions to work in a consistent, coherent manner according to an overarching political logic. And of course, third area of work, it's not last but not least, I just mentioned them because they have to have some kind of order, but all of them have to happen simultaneously, is really establishing a much better dialogue with the regimes that are in power, because they are in power and because they're the ones you need to speak to in the various countries of the Sahel. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, which have military regimes. Chad is also, for all intents and purposes, a military regime, and Mauritania as well, being quite relevant. The other dimension that we've been working on is trying to develop an approach with regional actors. And I must say, when I started a year and a half ago, I felt very lonely because ECOWAS was out of action because of when Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger left ECOWAS. Essentially, ECOWAS was no longer a useful interlocutor for talking about those countries because it had ceased to have the linkage. We know as European Union how difficult it was when the UK left the European Union, and we spent several years without being able to develop a decent conversation. Of course, it was all their fault. But the point is, it's difficult when you have a divorce to reestablish a dialogue. And fortunately, we have that now with a very good one with the UK, but with respect to ECOWAS and the AES countries, it's not quite there yet, but it's getting there. African Union was missing in action. African Union was absolutely missing in action. And I said I felt lonely, but that was at the beginning, because now we have a situation where ECOWAS, AES are beginning to talk. African Union has reestablished itself as a significant player after having been absent for quite some time, since the beginning of the military coups. And now we have very useful partners with whom to work. United Nations has been there all the time, but again, the United Nations dealing with the same kind of empty space that we've had to deal with. So now we have a convergence of international actors that gives us much greater traction in what we do. I think that we've made substantial progress on all of the different fields. So there is much greater convergence amongst the member states today, not the member states of the European Union, not homogeneity, because that's not achievable, and it's not our objective. There are sometimes some areas of conflictuality amongst us, but it's much better now than it was a year or two ago. In terms of the instruments of the European Union, again, I think that there is a sense of direction. It's all work in progress, but a sense of direction that is allowing us to come together in a way that can make us, that can give us some firepower in terms of our approaches in an entirely metaphorical way, of course, since I'm not talking about using military force in the area. And with respect to the countries of the region, I think we've established bridgeheads of communication, of dialogue, that also result from the fact that they do want to have a relationship with the European Union, and there are many sensitivities attached to that, but clearly they do see the European Union as an important actor in their future, and so we're managing there as well. So things are crystallizing in a way. Work in progress is an expression that is always valid. It's always a lot of, there's always a lot more work. And whenever we reach a milestone, have a significant achievement, that's great, excellent to celebrate that evening. But the next day, it's back at the coal face, because there is more. There's always more work to be done. But we're making progress. There is crystallization of a significantly different approach. And this significantly different approach is based on our interests. It is, which doesn't mean abandoning values and principles. In fact, values and principles have to be part of our conversations. They have to be present, because otherwise we would not be being honest also with our interlocutors. What we cannot do, though, is say that until you are up to the level of my expectations in terms of my values, then I'm not going to talk to you. We cannot allow ourselves to be paralyzed by positions of principle that we don't always stand up to ourselves. So I think the point here is that values and principles are relevant. They're an important element. They are not to be brushed aside, but we have to be able to say we agree to disagree on this point. We're going to continue our conversation. We're going to talk about other things, and eventually we will come back again and we will talk about this further until we have a better understanding of each other. Our approach is country by country, because these different countries they correspond to very different realities. They have some common aspects, but they also have very different historical trajectories and local realities. It's an approach which we have constructed around three central pillars, which are political and diplomatic engagement. And I think that I've sufficiently explained when I say political and diplomatic engagement. If you read that in a document, probably you skip over and go on to the next one, the relevant one. But actually, this is very much a relevant one, because part of our problems result from our incapacity to have a proper political and diplomatic engagement. So that's pillar one. Pillar two, working on human security. Working on, there's no consensus amongst us to be supporting militarily the armed forces of military regimes. But we cannot be absent from the topic of security, because that is the central topic, the immediate topic that is the main concern of governments and of populations of the region. Human security, I think, is the appropriate framing for us to be able to deploy our instruments in a manner that is not military, but it is contributing towards security. And thirdly, what I would call working towards socioeconomic resilience, creating circumstances for, even though reality may be quite adverse, for populations to be able to stay where they are rather than be displaced, and to be able to develop some kind of future for themselves. If we manage to promote human security, if we manage to promote some socioeconomic resilience step by step, you're taking oxygen away from the recruitment of armed groups, from the temptation to do absolutely crazy things like cross the Sahara Desert and then cross the Mediterranean in order to try to reach reach Europe on the other side at the enormous risk of dying in the meantime. So this is our three-pronged approach, while working closely, and it's possible now, with the UN, with ECOWAS, with the African Union, who have to be central. This slogan of African solutions for African problems is a slogan that we should respect when there are African solutions, and they begin to appear now. They have not been present in the past few years, and now there are efforts towards that. So this is something that we should be supportive of. So I'm really looking forward, and I'll stop here, to Irish contribution over the next 6 months to this. I'm very grateful for the fact that Ireland has always been very supportive in our European conversations, has always been very supportive of the development of this approach. And even though when you have the presidency of the European Union, you have 100 or 1,000 topics that are all of great magnitude, I hope that for Ireland, this will also be one. Above all, because I think that we all have to be very conscious that we neglect the Sahel at our own peril. The Sahel will come back to us. And the Sahel is not going to disappear if we close our eyes. And I'm very concerned that as we, for evident and easily justified reasons, focus our attention on Ukraine and on Gaza and on Iran and on a complicated and ever more complicated transatlantic relationship and so many other things, I'm very concerned that in a few years we'll be saying, why weren't we paying attention to the Sahel? So that's my appeal, is that we should be paying attention to the Sahel, and I'm very pleased that, very confident that with the Irish presidency we will have something of a spotlight as well, amongst many other places also shining on the Sahel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Special Representative. How are we doing? Oh, we're doing okay. I'm going to kick off with a very quick question. I'm going to abuse my role as chair, and I'm going to invite you all to think about your questions. We will take a round of questions now in one moment. But before we kind of kick into that, first of all, I want to thank you for that really stimulating conversation where you're having critical reflection around the engagement of the EU to date and how that will shift and change over time. I do need to kind of prompt on one particular point that you raised in relation to EU values and not necessarily being as led by our values or positioning our values in a similar way, particularly at this moment where we're seeing the dissipation of values in international affairs across the board. So what do you mean by that? I mean, recognizing that ethics, values and principles are not elegant trimmings, but they are indeed, they do guide us in terms of who we engage with, what we engage around, and how we cooperate together. How do you anticipate, or how do you envision the kind of suspension of values?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this is a delicate issue, and it's not one that is very conducive to a simple formula. I would say it's not just about, how we engage, it's about who we are. And our values, hopefully, are present in who we are. What I'm saying is that if we do not manage to have a properly calibrated approach, if we arrive only with a set of prescriptions about how others should act, we're not very likely to go very far in a conversation. In order for us to be able to promote value, democracy, human rights, fundamental core values for the European Union, for European countries, for our way of life, in order to be able to promote that, you have to be able to engage in manners that are of interest for the other side. If one arrives saying, I've got various recipes for your behavior that you're not currently following and that you have to, that isn't going to go far. So my point is that we cannot allow our values to be an impediment to a conversation. They have to, on the contrary, we have to be able to promote our values through the development of a conversation. If we say either you follow what we prescribe, and which we sometimes fail to do ourselves, or we're not having a conversation, then now I think that I can make that argument in abstract, and in practical terms, it is one that has to be carefully measured in order for one not to systematically say, this is too complicated, I'm going to leave this aside for the moment, and then say that same thing next time and the time after. No, the interlocutor has to understand also where we're coming from, and being honest is to say that this is important. It's important for our societies, it's important for our approach, but it's not going to be a precondition for any kind of conversation.
Thank you. And I do have a couple of fantastic questions online that will follow through with that. But before I do want to come to our audience here as well and see. I'll start, Jill, with yourself. And we'll take one round. I'll come to Jana next. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for such a fantastically interesting presentation. I have two questions. I just wondered, the new actors that you mentioned that are involved, who they are, perhaps Norway or Switzerland, I'm not sure. And if so, what is their strategy? How did you engage them? Or have they bought into the convergent strategy that you have developed now within the EEAS? And the second one really goes back to a speech I read that you gave somewhere. I think often people don't get really the link between organized crime and terrorism. And you had a wonderful example, which I'll perhaps let you give yourself, about a dam being built in South America and the excess energy and what was done with that, leading to sort of crypto mining, etc.
Thanks so much. I am going to take a round of questions, if that's okay. And I would ask people to introduce themselves as well. I will come to you now in 1 second, former president, or former Taoiseach, not president, sorry. But I will come to Janan first, if I may, and then we'll come to former Taoiseach and Minister for
Thanks. Janan McKenna from DOCUS, the Network for the International Development and Humanitarian Organisations. Just in terms of the 3 pillars that you outlined there towards the end, can you elaborate how you see the role of civil society in those? Because I think obviously at the outset you mentioned around the issues around not harmonising with kind of the local or national context enough. So obviously civil society is a key way to overcome that. So I just wanted to see what your ideas are around that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And we have one more question from former Taoiseach and Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thanks very much. Just wonder if you could say a little bit more about maybe what Ireland could do in terms of raising our presence and contribution to the region. I know we previously had a military mission in Mali, but that's now finished, and we've increased our international development. But as a small player, as a small country, are there things you would advise or like to see Ireland doing that could contribute both to the stability of the region and also EU influence there?
I'm coming back to you.
Yep. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for this set of questions. On the new actors, so 2 weeks ago I was in Turkey, Turkey, and we do have to engage. I don't think that we particularly need to engage with Russia. It's perfectly clear what they're trying to do, and it's completely incompatible. China, interestingly enough, with whom we do not share much in the way of values, but in its resource extraction agenda, it is keen on stability. Insecurity is not good for resource extraction. So that's an interesting point. And curiously enough, we had I would say, a moment of fame because they have also difficulties in engaging with some of the countries. When Chinese approached us and say, how can you deal with this regime in Niger? It's very very difficult. We don't understand them at all. So that was curious, and it's a way of seeing that China is also a little bit lost in this context. And we may have points of convergence here or there. And they're always very keen to say, we're not Russia, we're very different from Russia. The Gulf countries are newcomers with a lot of money, and which can have big impact. And I think we need to be engaging more with them so that their impact is stability producing rather than the opposite. The question of organized crime is an important one, because just as I said that people are not recruited due to religious fanaticism, I think that there are many, many different kinds of armed groups in the region because of this lack of state control. And some of them have use a mask of religiosity to justify themselves, but are in fact little more than organized criminal gangs. And some of these organized criminal gangs are linked up to what are increasingly global networks. So a few years ago, we had a situation where over centuries, we've had a situation where the Sahel has been a great arena for smuggling. In the good old days, it was tobacco and whiskey and so on. Now it's arms, it's drugs, but more than that, it's not just logistics. It is linking up to worldwide networks that go from money laundering to the production of illicit goods. And the example that you referred to came from the fact that drugs are going from South America to Europe and also to the US, crossing the Atlantic twice, via the ports of West Africa. In between Brazil, the three tripartite border between Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, there is an area of very weak governance which is very much out of state control, lots of arms dealings and so on. This is a curious area because in the 70s, the second largest dam in the world, Iguazu, was built there. And the Iguazu dam, built on the Paraguayan Brazilian border, was built on the basis of 50-50, meaning 50% of electricity to each country. It produces about 40% of the total electricity consumed in Brazil. So vast amount. As for Paraguay, it gets the same amount of electricity. What to do when you have a population of 7 million with all that electricity? It sells some to Argentina, it sells some back to Brazil. But basically in this day and age, what can one do with excess of electricity? So it has become a center for cryptocurrency, crypto mining, which is great for money laundering. And then we link back to money that is circulating around the ports of West Africa with certain communities that are also present in South America. So this is really the globalization of organized crime, and it affects the Sahel as much as anywhere. On Jane Ann, on the question of the role of civil society, I think it has to have a fundamental role. It's not easy because the space for civil society is very much under pressure. It's shrinking. But on the other hand, these are fundamental interlocutors for us. And it is possible. I think that the way to do it is really working with local authorities who are much more open to their civil society neighbors, rather than to do it in a more abstract theoretical way through the central state. But in order to be able to reach the populations in the way that we want, we need to have these interlocutors, and civil society there are fundamental for production of resilience, of being able to work at the community level. Now, I come from a small country. Small is it's a little bit bigger than Ireland, but still in the European dimension or in the global dimension in the same league, I would say. And I think there is a lot that smaller countries can do in terms of course, we don't have the resources that we can deploy across the board, but we can work very well in niche areas. And here in Dublin, I don't need to explain that because Ireland has actually worked food security. We were talking at lunch on women, peace and security. These are areas which are extremely relevant for the region and which I think allow us to have something of a spotlight. Then I've been with Irish troops in MINUSMA. If I'm not mistaken, also with EUTM, with the European Union training mission in Mali. So that presence in itself from a country which is neutral. It's neutral constitutionally, but it's also neutral in the eyes of others. It's a country that does not carry baggage with it. On the contrary, it's a country that can say we too were colonized, which has a lot of value as a conversation opener, I would say, as an empathy generator. So I see Ireland as a valuable member state of the European Union in terms of enriching what the European Union can be as an interlocutor, rather than just a collection of large states or ones that used to have, like mine, big colonial territories and so on. So I'm not. I don't want to be prescriptive in Ireland, but I would like to encourage Irish foreign policy makers to not be timid about what Ireland can do.
Thank you so much. And I would like to, first of all, I'd like to say you can clearly tell that there's quite an interest in this conversation. And I want to apologise profusely to those online who I didn't get to bring in your questions or to come back out to the audience for a second round of questions. I think we could keep you here easily for another half an hour. However, we are over time. So with that, I want to say a huge thank you to you for giving us your time today and for this stimulating conversations. Special Representative Cravinho, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.